Hello and welcome back to Choir with Knut. 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 What I just demonstrated is an example, well, a very rough example of an ostinato. And some of you might have heard about this term before, and it sounds a little bit weird, like ostinato. What does that mean? What part of the music is ostinato? That's what I'm here to talk about today. Ostinatos are very important in pop music. So today we're going to have a look at what exactly they are. I'll show you some examples of different types of ostinatos, and we'll talk about how you can make one for your arrangement. So without any further ado, let's have a look at ostinatos. The word ostinato means stubborn and refers to the repetitive and unchanging nature ostinatos tend to have. Oh, and the plural of ostinato can be either ostinatos or ostinati, though the latter is more true to the word's Italian roots. We typically use this term for Western classical art music, with riff or vamp being the terms used in pop music. But they are by and large the same concept, and I'll use them interchangeably in this video. An ostinato is a repeated pattern, usually melodic but potentially also just rhythmic, which runs through large portions of a piece of music and is a significant part of its character. While there is limited use of ostinato in medieval music, it really came to the forefront during the Baroque period, when a lot of music used an instrumental backing referred to as basso ostinato, or ground bass. This was a repeated bass line that would run throughout all or the majority of a composition, with the other parts playing countermelodies against it. The most famous example is probably the lament bass, which was essentially a chromatic descent from the tonic note to the dominant note. The aria When I Am Laid in Earth from Henry Purcell's opera Dido and Aeneas used this type of bass line to great effect. When I am laid in earth, may my wrongs create no trouble in thy breast. Lament bass lines remain popular and are still used in contemporary music. My funny Valentine, sweet comic Valentine, you make me smile with my heart. Some other examples of classical compositions that use ostinatos are Passacaglia and Fugue in C minor by Bach, Bolero by Ravel, and St. Paul's Suite by Holst, in which he even names the movement with an ostinato, ostinato. Of course, the use of ostinatos isn't strictly limited to Western classical art music, and you can find plenty of examples from traditional music from all over the world that use ostinatos. Some examples are in Indian classical music, you have a concept called lehara or nagma, which is a repeated melodic pattern that is pretty much the same as an ostinato, or similar to what we call an ostinato in the West. You also, in Latin American music, have a rhythm called the tumbao, which is based on the clave rhythm, and which is a repeated bass pattern that you find in different types of Latin American music. Else you have stuff like gamelan music from Indonesia, which is the kind that they play on like gongs and xylophone like instruments. That also uses a lot of ostinatos. However, these aren't really my specialty, and it goes a little beyond the scope of this video, as I'm mostly concerned with like Western and pop music. But I thought I'd mention it. But as I said, this is not something I'm specialized in, so I'm not going to go talking about gamelan music. You'll have to go to a gamelan expert to learn about that. Okay, let's look at the use of ostinatos in popular music. In popular music, you wouldn't really call them ostinatos, you'd call them, as I said, riffs or vamps, as ostinato is more of a classical term. Very broadly, you can divide riffs in popular music into 4 categories. You have bassline riffs, you have interlude riffs, you have harmonic or rhythmic backing riffs, and you have counterpoint riffs. There's some overlap between the 2 last categories, which I'll get to, but do note that these aren't like formal terms. This is just what I kind of chose to call them for the purposes of this video. Anyway, let's look at a few examples of each of these types of riffs. Bassline riffs. These are probably the most common types of riffs, and were extremely common in the music of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Plenty of R&B music from the Motown label use prominent bassline riffs, such as I Want You Back by the Jackson 5.
When I had you to myself, I didn't want you around. Those pretty faces always made you stand out in a crowd.
Notice how the bass line informs the style of the song with prominent syncopations and anticipations of the first beat in the bar. This was carried on in the disco music that followed, which often uses elaborate and repeated bass lines.
Good times, these are the good times. Leave your cares behind. These are the good times.
Notice here how semiquaver offbeats feature prominently, creating rhythmic tension which is later resolved by playing on the beat. A lot of information about the style of a song will be found in the bass line. For example, in jazz music, you often find a so-called walking bass line with a bass note on every beat, which might sound something like dum 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 dum. In pop music, you often find bass notes on 1 and 3 with an extra offbeat on the 2-and and the 4-and, such as dum 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 dum. And this gives you some information about what kind of music it is. In a cappella music, you often don't have drums unless you use a beatboxer. So having an effective bass line is useful in conveying information about the style, and this can kind of compensate for the lack of any percussion. Next, let's look at interlude riffs. These are riffs that aren't performed at the same time as the melody, but rather in their own sections of the song. They're a staple of the guitar-heavy rock music of the 70s and 80s. For example, Smoke on the Water by Deep Purple uses an incredibly famous riff that is probably more known than the actual melody of the song. The same can be said of Survivor's 1982 hit Eye of the Tiger, which uses an incredibly well-known guitar riff. You have a lot of flexibility with interlude riffs because you're not so dependent on having something that works directly with the main melody, as they happen in their own sections of the song. If you're constructing one, think about ways it can contrast a bit with the main melody. So if the melody is very staccato, then writing an interlude that is a bit more legato will help to create some contrast. And likewise, if your melody has a lot of long notes, using phrases with shorter notes will work better as an interlude riff. Now, if you're writing an interlude riff for voices, you can also use lyrics to great effect. You can think about ways of either commenting on the lyrics or using them in different ways. One song that I think does this really well is Bridge Over Troubled Water by Aretha Franklin. If you've heard this recording, it actually starts with like 2 minutes of a bit of vocal ostinato and improvisation before she actually starts singing the song. This is a bit of a no-no in pop music, as you're generally supposed to try and get to the chorus as quickly as possible. My composition teacher used to say, get to the chorus before the 1 minute mark, otherwise people will get bored. But this recording was a #1 hit, so definitely check it out. It has a really, really cool vocal ostinato. Finally, let's talk about harmonic or rhythmic backing riffs and counterpoint riffs. These will be quite similar in that they both happen at the same time as the main melody and not as a bass line, but a counterpoint riff will be more of a standalone line, whereas harmonic or rhythmic riffs will have less of a standalone quality, yet definitely still be an integral part of the song. For instance, You Really Got Me by the Kinks has an extremely well-known guitar backing that runs alongside the main melody and defines the sound of the track.
Girl, you really got me going. You got me so I don't know what I'm doing. Yeah, you really got me now. You got me so I can't sleep at night.
This riff does modulate according to the chord progression of the song, but this is fine. An example of a riff that has more of a counterpoint quality would be the string line from the choruses of Ain't No Stoppin' Us Now by the disco duo McFadden and Whitehead.
Ain't no stopping us now. We're on the move. Ain't no stopping us now. We've got the groove.
Interestingly, this track has a very prominent ostinato line in the bass as well. In fact, you will find lots of effective ostinatos in the disco music of the 70s. It's no wonder that tracks such as Good Times have been extensively sampled by other artists. Essentially, if you're putting harmonic or rhythmic riffs into your vocal arrangements, you can just put them into your backing parts, and as long as they reflect the style of the song, they should work really well. Certain genres, such as bossa nova, have long established rhythmic backing parts that you can use, and these will make your tracks sound like they're in the style. With harmonic riffs, many genres of music have long established harmonic traditions, such as blues music, which typically uses 12-bar, repeated 12-bar patterns that have kind of the same chord progression throughout. So this is something you can do to make sure your track sounds like a blues. Counterpoint riffs aren't very common in pop music, and I was kind of struggling a bit to find good examples. There is one I know which is maybe known to my Scandinavian listeners, not so well known perhaps outside of that. It's a track by a Swedish artist called Veronica Maggio, and it's called Måndagsbarn. And it's got a great counterpoint riff in the string line. Even if you don't speak Swedish, I recommend you listen to it because it does have a very clear counterpoint ostinato that runs alongside the main melody. With any riff, you're essentially looking at creating a counter melody. And I already made a video about making counter melodies, which you might find useful. I'll link this on the screen now, so check it out and you might get some ideas about how to construct an effective ostinato. So with this in mind, we can look at some ways of constructing ostinatos for your arrangements. The first thing you'll have to decide is how many voice parts you'll want to allocate to your ostinato. For some of the types of ostinatos, this will be given. A bassline ostinato will be in the bass voice, and a counterpoint ostinato will probably just need one voice. If you're designing an interlude ostinato, there won't be a separate melody happening at the same time, so you're not too constrained. But with harmonic or rhythmic ostinatos, you'll want to make sure you have enough parts available. Next, look at what's already in your track and how your ostinato will support the other parts. Creating an ostinato is similar to creating a counter melody, with the main exception being that an ostinato is repeated. In choir arrangements, there will probably be a limit to how much you can lay on top of the other parts, unless your choir is very large. So thinking about where in range and pitch to focus your ostinato will help create a strong line. Finally, think about the style of the song and how your ostinato can strengthen it by using stylistic features. For instance, if your song has an R&B style, a bassline ostinato will work well, whereas a pop track with a repeated 4-chord backing will benefit from a harmonic ostinato that supports the melody. For any ostinato that isn't purely rhythmic, think about the chord progression of the song and what notes you can use that will support it and preferably not double other existing notes. Like I said earlier, creating an ostinato is pretty much like creating a counter melody. So if you have a look at some guidelines for good counterpoint, these can help you to make sure your ostinato is effective. Now, though ostinato kind of implies that it should be running throughout a whole composition, in practice, this isn't really commonly done. So don't feel like you have to invent something that people want to listen to continuously for 3, 4, 5 minutes. You can just use it for parts of the song and it should still be fine. Finally, if you're in doubt about whether your ostinato works or not, A good trick I know is to just kind of take a break, go away from your song and do something else, and then come back a few hours later and see if you can still remember your ostinato. If you can still remember it, then it's probably, it's probably a good ostinato. Don't be too concerned about it if you can't remember it. It means that probably it wasn't really that good to begin with. Anyway, that's it for today's video. I hope you learned something. Please leave me a comment if you have any questions, or if you know of any songs that use really good and effective ostinatos that you want to share. Remember to follow me on Facebook and Instagram, and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you in the next video.